Welcome to the final episode of Exploring the Messy Middle, where we're uncovering how behavioral economics can help your brand show up in the right place at the right time to boost sales, conversions, and brand love. I'm Dan Monheit, co-founder and strategy director at Hardhat, and joining me from Google Australia and New Zealand today are two consumer behaviour specialists, head of consumer market research, Rachel Powell.
Hey everyone.
Hey Rach, and head of strategy and insights, Kristen Sutter.
Hey guys, our final episode.
No, it's happy and it's sad.
Yeah.
All right, dear listeners, if you have missed the first 3 episodes, I highly recommend you get yourself up to speed. Otherwise, this is going to be kind of confusing. But for those of you joining for the first time, we are discussing the results of a huge global research project called The Messy Middle, which investigates the complex and, dare I say, messy process of consumer decision making. We started by looking at the dino, irrational, and astro, rational brain that lives within all of us. We then covered the 7 key behavioural principles that guide consumer decision making before looking at how activating those different principles change people's brand preference. Kristen, Rachel, what do we got today?
So get excited because today we're zeroing in on the key takeaways and principles. So really what brands can do to understand and better speak to their audiences.
Yeah, I am excited. Don't worry about that because honestly, the first 3 episodes have all been good stuff, but today is the really, really good stuff. We're getting into how marketers can actually implement these techniques to grow brands and grow sales.
Absolutely. So drum roll, please. Very good job, guys.
It's so high tech.
We have 3 key takeaways that have emerged really from this research because great things come in threes. And we'll go through these in detail for the rest of the episode. But the first is really the simplest. And you've heard us say it a few times throughout this, is that it's just to be there. Showing up, maintaining your brand presence when consumers are really at that point of making a decision. This may seem intuitive or even obvious, but what we've discovered was that brand presence has a far greater effect on consumer choice than we ever would have imagined.
Yeah, this is so true. Honestly, I could not believe it when we went through the research. The impact of just turning up was far beyond what I ever could have imagined. We've all heard that saying that turning up is half the battle, which as it turns out is kind of almost right, or at least it's a third of the battle in a lot of cases.
That's right. So the second key takeaway for brands is to be compelling. That means once there, we need to make sure that we're saying the right thing and saying it in a way that's connecting with our audience. This is all about leveraging those key behavioural principles that we've been talking about throughout the series. And often making small, simple language tweaks can nudge consumers into taking action.
Yeah, and I think this was where a lot of the real magic was because, as I think about it, activating a number of those principles, like telling people there's only 3 items left or that a lot of your friends also really like this product, is free or almost free for brands to do, and it can have a serious impact on conversions and sales.
Yes, and the best things in life are free.
Like a free breakfast.
Yes, exactly. So there's the be there, be compelling. And the third key takeaway that we'll talk a lot more about today is being experimental. And that's with your messaging, platforms, audiences. And again, we'll get into this a little bit more detail, but one of the great benefits, especially of digital marketing, is it allows us to continuously run, test, reevaluate, and refine how we're showing up for our consumers and our audiences.
All right, guys, this is going to be awesome. The excitement is palpable. Rachel, principle 1, be there, give us the good stuff.
So you'll remember that in this study, we tested 25 product and service categories globally, 6 of them here in Australia. And we started by asking consumers to pick a favourite brand and a second favourite brand. At that point, we were only comparing the effect of the second favourite brand being present. So everything else, all of the potential triggers, what the brands were offering, they're being held consistent. And we asked consumers, which one would you choose? Now, for those that can see the slide here, we're seeing across all the different categories we've tested, in the grey, the share for the first choice brand, and the blue is the share captured by the second choice brand, purely due to that brand being present. It's consistent across all categories and countries, the impact that being there has on brand preference.
Right, which gives us the universal rule, which I just created, be there, get share.
Nice.
Ooh,
That's
I
good.
like that.
That's
good.
Nice.
Huh? It's catchy.
Rhymes.
Yeah.
I just did that right now. All right. So for our audio-only listeners out there, what kind of a range did you guys see reflected in the data between those different categories?
So to your point earlier, Dan, it's about a third, but it ranges from 18% for smartphones through to 39% for dresses and sofas. In many ways, it's fairly intuitive. Some categories and brands are going to be more resistant to this effect than others, but the big point here is that consistently across all the categories, all a competitor has to do to gain market share is just show up and be there.
Be there, get share, right? And it is big. And to be fair though, even though you say, look, some categories are more resistant than others, even in the really resistant categories, we are still talking about pulling almost 20% preference share away from a preferred brand just by turning up at the right time. We see this principle reflected really clearly out in physical retail. When I think about the heating up battle for supermarket shelves, it is because brands understand how important it is to be on shelf at the right time in the right position. And there is almost a direct correlation between how hard it is to get on shelf and how close that shelf is to the cash register. So if you are anyone other than Wrigley's, good luck trying to get another product next to the chewing gum right next to the checkout.
Yes.
Outside of supermarkets, I think there's also a really compelling example of this, or at least an observation from fast food or from QSR restaurants. So when I think back to the 80s, happy times, McDonald's was already really well entrenched in the Australian market, having been here for around about 20 years. And then almost overnight, we started seeing Subway stores just pop up everywhere. And I don't know if this was their strategy or it just was my observations of what their strategy may have been, but it seemed that their launch strategy in Australia was, if there is a Macca's, we will be within 100 meters of it. And it was like everywhere you saw a McDonald's, down the street, around the corner, across the road, a Subway had either just opened or was coming soon. And so this idea, I guess, is them just banking on the fact that if they are just there next to a McDonald's, some portion of McDonald's customers, maybe even a third, according to the research, maybe a third, right, may just defect. And since those early 80s, we've seen Subway grow to become the largest fast food restaurant in Australia by store numbers. They've got over 1,300 of them now dotted across the country. So, yeah, amazing.
I'm loving the throwbacks we have here, from 90s baggy jeans early on to now like 80s and Macca's Subway. It's we're showing our age potentially a bit. So yeah, it's taken me a while to call it Macca's. For the longest time, I had no idea what Australians were talking about, but I think I've fully assimilated now. So one way that we like to think about this at Google, I love your offline examples and that sort of real life piece, but we know a lot of our lives have translated into online and digital, and especially now. So one of the things we think about is how to be there, most notably with Google search, because we see that so many consumers are using search in their path to purchase and helping navigate that messy middle, whether it's doing a search to help explore a specific feature or to evaluate kind of what brands or features they actually really want. But what we tested in the study, and what was really had that compelling kind of move from first choice brand to second choice brand, was that being there at the point of decision. When someone is saying and has to make a decision, being there actually helps you get share. Be there, get share. Did you see what I did there?
I like that. That's good. I'm going to write that down.
I've adopted it. You've already got it in my brain.
It's going global.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned before, once you're there, that is a third of the battle. But then you need to make sure you're saying the right thing and in a way that's really compelling and engaging for your audiences. So how do you be compelling? And to test this, we ended up, if you remember, taking it right to the extreme. So making up a completely fictitious fake brand and then supercharging it with all 7 of our behavioral principles. So giving it a really compelling message that appeals to that dino brain. So 5-star ratings, heuristics that help people shortcut, etc.
Yeah, and that worked. Like, I'm still waiting on my Google face cream to arrive, and it is going to be awesome when it gets here.
Yeah. You might be waiting for a while, Dan, so I wouldn't hold your breath.
But I'm glad you're enthusiastic about that fake brand, because we found the same thing with our consumers. On average, more than 50% of them would happily choose a completely fake brand simply based on a really compelling proposition that appeals to that dino brain. So it ranged from 28% for cereals through to 87% for car insurance.
Wow.
And some of the numbers are quite big. And it's important, I guess, to remember for marketers, and it really reinforces the point that, we can appeal to the rational brain as much as we like, but it's those compelling propositions that get the dino brain really engaged. They're going to nudge people into choosing brands they hadn't originally thought they were going to choose.
For sure. And where we see a lot of this is when we observe challenger brands coming into really well-established categories. And one of the best examples of this, I think, is what toilet paper brand Who Gives a Crap did to the Australian and ultimately global toilet paper market. So these guys came into a category where the heuristics, those sort of shortcuts or rules of thumb, were already pretty well defined. So if you were buying or selling toilet paper, it was all about softness or texture or colors or patterns or maybe how many puppies you had in your commercial. And what Who Gives a Crap did was they said, well, all of those heuristics are kind of nice, but they're table stakes. And really, the criteria we're going to give you to think about is doing social good. And so we are going to donate 50% of the profits to organizations around the world that work to improve sanitation and water in the developing world. And so as well as having the power of social good as a heuristic, they sort of added a big convenience heuristic through their distribution model and also the power of now through very fast delivery. And it has clearly worked incredibly well for them. They started in 2013 and now global and have given millions and millions of dollars to some incredible causes. So a wonderful way of turning up and being compelling with new heuristics that the category wasn't really thinking about before.
Yes, that is such a good example. I love it because it feels like a product that nobody would ever really care that much about or think that much about. Toilet paper. I mean, how much brain space can you give it? But all of a sudden it becomes this thing that you feel really connected to, and it makes you choose them versus any competitor who's still using puppies, which I do like puppies in advertising, but that's an incredible use of marketing.
Yeah, so it turns out Who Gives a Crap? A lot of people, a lot of them. If we swing maybe into the service categories, I think there's also a masterclass that happened when Optus launched into the Australian market, which before they got here was pretty much a one telco town. And these guys pretty much set the gold standard in using power of free by launching in Australia with this thing called Optus Yes Time, which was free calls between Optus numbers, 8 p.m. to midnight, 5 nights a week. And what this meant was that, if you're a student, as I was at the time, and every penny counted, the promise of getting 4 hours of free calls to all of your friends every weeknight was incredible, especially when phone bills were still pretty big at the time. And what was so brilliant about this was that the way they did it, almost that the network effect of it meant that the social proof kicked in almost immediately as well. So the idea of it being free got people there to start with. Immediately then your whole friendship group was on Optus, and it was a very brave person who said, no, I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to get on my own network and find out pretty quickly no one's going to call me because you have to pay for it. So brilliant example of how to use the power of free and social proof to launch a telco.
Yeah, that's amazing. And we talk about the importance of creative all the time. And we've done research that shows that across every campaign, creative has the strongest impact on ROI by far. But we see that clients will spend a lot of time on their TV, their print, your video creative. And while the main thing is that they don't really think about what they're saying in search. And really it's important to think across every conversation and how you're showing up, not only show up, but how you're showing up as well. An example, if you're doing a search, say best SUV during my last car shopping journey, And I was just overwhelmed all the time by seeing so many brands that were just saying the same thing when really they could have used this as an opportunity to kind of nudge me with these behavioral principles and test different types of creative to respond to me. Because of this, we've at Google kind of built this functionality into a lot of our tools across YouTube and search, like our video ad builder and responsive search ads, to help kind of make sure that we're customizing and testing that creative across all platforms.
Yeah, and I think that's increasingly important too as consumer behaviours continue to shift and change, that they're experimenting and testing, which actually brings us to our third and final take home for marketers, which is constantly reevaluate what you think you know and be experimental. And it's really important. So interestingly, from the research, before we got into kind of our simulations, we asked people, okay, you're about to buy a certain product or category. What do you think is the biggest factor in terms of influencing your decision? Then we'd actually run the research and look at, okay, what was the biggest influence in making the decision? And it was often completely different or a different combination. We call this the say-do gap. So we take private health insurance, for example, which you can see here on this slide. Consumers thought they'd choose a brand based on things like authority bias. So believing the insurance provider was a really trusted authority in this space. But actually, when we looked at the research, the choice was more often than not influenced by principles like power of free and power of now.
Wow, this is outrageous. Are you saying we don't really know what motivates us?
That's 100% correct. And we also don't know what motivates our consumers either. We can't guess or make assumptions. Brands really need to consider a few things. Making sure that it's based on fact and data and we actually know how consumers are making decisions. And then also considering the context in which consumers are searching or purchasing or using their products and services. Because that context can also influence the way that each of those behavioural principles comes to life and manifests. And then in turn impacts which brands they're choosing when they're choosing to purchase.
I mean, this makes so much sense, right? Because as the context changes, we've got to change, or dare I say, pivot what we're doing, right?
There's that word, pivot.
Yes.
I think an amazing example of a pivoting strategy is what we've seen happen with the Kogan.com business. So these guys launched, I don't know if it was 12 or 13 years ago, and the only thing they did in the early days was direct manufacture and import TVs and sell them online to consumers here, which was kind of unprecedented at the time. And in those early days, really the only way they could get any market share was to rely on the authority bias. So they needed to get their TVs, which were basically unheard of, reviewed by some of the toughest critics and also discussed in some of the hardest environments like Whirlpool forums where people will legitimately spend a day debating the merits of having 3 or 4 USB ports on the side of your television. So they really had to, it was almost like altitude training for those guys in this really, really tough environment. Fast forward 13 years later, and the business is now gigantic. And while those reviews and tough critics are still really important for them, they've been able to pivot or layer on other biases like social proof, talking about how many other million Australians are currently using Kogan.com, or leveraging the power of now with their expedited shipping, or leveraging scarcity bias by giving people access to products that are otherwise very hard to come by in Australia. And what we've seen is, the rest is history. They are, I think, Australia's largest online retailer now and absolutely going great guns.
Yeah, and it sounds like I love that example because it shows how clearly they've pivoted, but they're experimenting. And I know that a lot of people are probably rolling their eyes when they hear us say, oh, everything's constantly changing and you've got to reevaluate. That's not easy for us to do, especially as humans. We're really uncomfortable with ambiguity. We don't like change. We're not built for it. Our brains aren't built for it. But you know who is really good at managing that kind of stuff?
Dinosaurs.
No. It's not dinosaurs.
Astronauts. I have been paying attention.
No.
It's camels.
It's rhetorical.
It's rhetorical.
Okay. Yeah,
Rhetoricals.
No, not those. I was thinking more along the lines of robots.
Of course.
So
yes.
yeah, and more specifically, artificial intelligence, machine learning. This is why Google has leaned so hard into these areas over the last few years, in particular, to really help Google or to really help our marketers adapt and quickly learn. Because you not only have to experiment with your messaging, it's one thing to experiment with your creative, but also the medium, the platforms, audiences, with all these people online and exploring different opportunities to reach your customers through all these platforms, it can feel really overwhelming. So we're constantly working with clients and partners to build that culture of experimentation, not only into just their online digital marketing, but into their marketing departments as a whole and into their business philosophy. So it kind of becomes more of an experimental culture.
All right, another big show today, guys. Way to bring it home strong. Just to do a quick little recap today, we discussed how important it is to be there to get share. All right, that when you're there, you also need to work out how to be compelling. And a big part of that is having an experimental culture within the business. How did I go?
Pretty good.
Perfect.
Like it.
Awesome.
Gold
All right.
star.
I feel like I'm on a hot streak here, so I'm going to do my best to do a quick little recap on everything we've learned over the last 4 episodes.
Okay, I'm excited to see how this goes.
All right, come on now. All right. All right, so the first thing we talked about was that humans are not rational. We have got that dino brain that lives within all of us, and it is real.
Yes, and hence my choosing a hotel based on a free breakfast that I never even got to eat.
It's
Still
a
sad.
sad story.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to episode 1 just to have another listen. The second thing was around that path between a trigger and a purchase is nowhere near as straight as we might like to imagine or believe that it is. So we discussed that new model of decision making, including that crazy infinite loop of evaluation and exploration that we have all lost hours and hours of our lives to.
Absolutely.
From there, we talked about the 7 behavioral principles that can help nudge consumers out of that infinite loop and hopefully into an online purchase.
That's right. Things like authority bias. I'm very sad I'm not wearing my lab coat for this last episode. I think it gave me a lot of credibility in episode 2.
But I think that in black, you kind of look more creative. So I,
Yeah.
I still believe you.
It's nice. You've still got the authority, Rach.
Yes.
Thanks, guys.
And finally, we talked about today how important it is to be there, be compelling, and have an experimental culture within your organization. How did I do? Yes.
Well done. Perfect.
Awesome.
Well
I'm in the
done.
club.
Yes. Well, you're still at club adjacent, maybe, but you're getting there.
All right. Can't wait to get fitted up for my lab coat, guys.
Yeah. Okay. We'll get you one.
All right, guys, that was great. I hope everybody out there has found this as fun and interesting as we have. A great way to stay in touch with ideas, inspiration, and experimental culture is to subscribe to Think with Google, which you can do at thinkwithgoogle.com/AUNZ. Thank you all so much for joining. Go out, do something awesome.
All right. Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
guys.
Bye.
Bye.